Welcome everyone to CBC's One Stop Business Workshop. I'm Nathalie Younglai, screenwriter, director, founder of BIPOC TV and Film, and I will be your moderator. Today we'll be talking to Niki Singh, manager of business and rights at CBC, who will be giving us a lowdown on how to negotiate a development deal. First, I'd like to acknowledge that this virtual session is taking place on Indigenous land. We are in solidarity with anyone who advocates for the decolonization and protecting the land. We recognize the peoples who have called this land home before the arrival of settlers and still do. Niki and I are settlers in Takaranto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Takaranto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Niki, so I've pitched CBC and got the big news call that they want to put my show into development. So now what?
Yeah, so let's get started. Why don't we go to the next slide, the first slide, and I can explain a little bit about why development is important. So like Nathalie mentioned, development is the process after the pitch. There was a session on pitching last week, so I do encourage you all to view it if you haven't already. But whether you're a writer or you're a producer, you have an idea for a show and we like it, as a broadcaster, we like it, but we want to explore a little bit more.
So it's not a green light, more like a yellow light?
Yeah, like that's a really good way of looking at it. Another good way of looking at it is kind of like dating. Your broadcaster is interested in you, but they're not quite sure if they want the full commitment to quote Beyonce. We're not quite sure if we want to put a ring on it. So development includes the commissioning of materials that will ultimately help in the production. It can include scripts, Bibles, demos, research reports. I've seen the whole kind of gambit of materials. More importantly, development allows broadcasters and creative teams to work together to just evaluate the creative and try to make a program better. And lastly, the really most important part about development is that it helps build a relationship between the broadcaster and the creative teams. Like any other industry, you want to know who you're working with, and development is a huge part of that process.
So for creators, when we pitch the production execs, but that at this point of the process, we're dealing with you at CBC?
Yes, so you lucky folks get to deal with me. And the first thing I'm going to ask for is when we first meet is for a budget. So if we want to go to the next slide. Yeah, so building a development budget. Budgets do vary and they're negotiated based on the creative materials that we're developing. A budget for a pilot script and a demo, budget for a pilot script and a Bible will look very different than a budget for a demo. So I've included some common costs that we often see in development budgets here. The first thing is your rights and your story acquisition costs. So if you're optioning like a book, so a couple years ago, we did an adaptation of the Book of Negroes, which was written by Canadian author Lawrence Hill. I would expect to see those agreements and costs associated with that option from the get-go.
Just to clarify, we as the writer creator have put money up front to option a book. Does that get reimbursed during development?
Yeah, sort of. It's sort of how broadcasters really work is that they'll pay for the rights to have in active development with them. So if you've had a book for like 5 years, you're probably not going to get reimbursed from your broadcaster, whether it's CBC or another broadcaster, for those past 5 years, but they will pay for whatever amount of time you need to have it in active development. So it's not a reimbursement, but it is to have costs associated with it being in active development. The next common cost that we often see is script writing costs. So the Writers Guild of Canada independent production agreement rates, they do vary based on script length. I do encourage you to check out these rates. They are available online if you're not familiar with it, but those tend to be what we see for script writing costs. The next thing is story editor, research fees, consultant costs. I don't always see this on every project, but let's say you're like doing a show on climate change. I would at least I would hope you would have costs associated in there with research. So again, it depends on the project and depends if it's what makes sense for that particular project. And last but not least is your producer fee and corporate overhead, probably what was most common producers care about, but this is how producers get paid. And that generally ranges from 10 to 20% of the budget. There are budget templates available online. Canada Media Fund has one that we often see, and Bell Fund also has one that you can use as well. So next slide. So once we get a budget negotiated, the question comes, who's paying for it? And that's where financing comes in. Your broadcaster will put up a portion of the financing, but more often than not, you're going to see another party paying for the rest of it. I've included some common sources of development financing here. Highly recommend you do visit these resources. And so check out Canada-wide funds like Canada Media Fund, Independent Production Fund, Bell Fund, and also any more local funds that you might have as well, like Creative BC and Nunavut Film. Next slide. So this is so important. I cannot stress this enough. It is so critical that you tell your broadcasters about any financing and that your broadcaster approves of whatever financing in your project, whether it's at development or production. Some financiers take rights that conflict with those that your broadcaster takes, which could effectively make or break your project. I understand that you sometimes want access to more money and more funds, but when we negotiate a budget and deliver for a specific set of deliverables, that's sort of our expectation. In this case, it's always better to ask for permission than forgiveness. I know that's not really how the saying goes, but always better to ask for permission than forgiveness.
So check with the parents before inviting others to the party.
Yes, as much as I hate being referred to as mom in this situation, it's definitely better to ask for permission, always.
Great. And would we get grounded or punished if we don't?
Yeah, grounded's a bit harsh. I would say there is a term in our agreement that says we can withdraw our contribution, at least for CBC agreements, should you get access to funding that we didn't approve of. I haven't had to exercise that term yet, and I really don't want to exercise that term. So again, we can avoid the situation altogether if we just communicate with one another. So speaking of development terms, if you want to go to the next slide. Yeah, so common development terms that we see on our agreement. The first one is the option. So standard development terms on your agreement will include a 12-month option to either license your program or to further develop your program. What exactly does this mean? So let's say we were doing a pilot script and a Bible and for stage of development. The broadcaster would have 12 months from the date that they accept those materials to decide whether they want to move forward to production or further develop. Further development can include, another script, maybe a demo, maybe some precasting. It does depend on the project. Again, understand that development is not a quick process and things can take time and up to years even. Any funds paid in development is considered an advance on your license fee. So I want you to think of the amounts in development like a deposit on production. It's an earlier, smaller amount of money that a broadcaster's putting up to secure their interest in the program. So for example, if your production license fee was $100 and you got $10 in development, you'd have $90 left for your production. I often get very large, onerous budgets that don't make sense for a particular stage of development. And as soon as I say, this is an advance on your license fee, those budgets come straight down. Because it's in an advance, it's in your interest as well as your broadcaster's interest to keep development to really what's needed at that particular stage. You don't want to blow all your money in development. That's just not a smart way to go. As well as deliverables, we also include in a development agreement, we'll also put in writing the specific materials that we want, like a pilot script or a Bible, delivery timelines, as well as budgets and financing. And the last term on sort of your development agreements, common terms you'll see is a repayment and credit obligation. So in the event you're not commissioned for production by your developing broadcaster and you're greenlit somewhere else, that broadcaster would be entitled to a repayment of the development amount and an end credit developed in association with on that production. So you want to go to the next slide. This is a screenshot I took of the coroner on CBC Gem, which Nathalie's a writer for.
Yes.
And
yeah. Watch it on CBC Gem.
Please do. So right at the bottom there, I hope you can all see it. It says developed in association with Bell Media. So this is one of CBC's top shows, and it came to us having had some development already done with another broadcaster. I mean, we did do some more later, but there was that initial development done by Bell. So again, they got a credit, and I'm sure they were repaid for the money that they put forward. Next slide. So this is my most important slide. I really hope if anything sinks in, this is it. So the first thing I want you guys to kind of consider is thinking about the earlier you consider about your production, the better. So it can seem a bit silly to say, but I'm always a bit surprised when I ask producers, like, how do you see this playing out in production? And I don't get a clear answer. The more you can think about how your production will be structured, the better off you will be. So cost, budget, where you're going to film, all those things. You don't need to have it all figured out. Like that's part of what development is for. But let's say you're a Toronto-based producer and you know your story is going to take place, a good chunk of it's going to take place in Manitoba. Find a Manitoba producing partner. Like that will make such a big difference.
I think that's a really important point and something I would not have thought about.
Totally, right? And it's just all I'm asking you to do really is just think about it. Like you don't have to have it all figured out, just think about it early on. Likewise with option fees, I often see high option fees in the agreement high option rates and terms or onerous creative approvals in your option agreements. Producers agree to it not because they don't think it's high, they know it's high. They want a development deal and they want to get those rights. And so they're willing to pay whatever it takes, but then those terms are not feasible in terms of production. So just think things through. You want to best set yourself up to be greenlit. When in doubt, at least on your option agreements, you can always write subject to broadcaster approval, and that might save you a lot of grief down the line. Next point I want to make is about termination. So it's a really tough business. Termination on your project can happen for a number of reasons. We don't always greenlight projects we develop. So we sometimes have to let things go. Again, think of it like dating. It's not you, it's me.
That's the worst.
It is the worst, but it is a reality. But yeah, keep in mind, broadcasters have budget restraints, mandates, strategies we have to follow, and there's also schedule restrictions. So again, often we're looking at our development slate and trying to fit it into those kind of components and pieces. Remember, broadcasters will always let you find a new home for your project subject to that credit and repayment obligation. Communicate, communicate, communicate. To me, the most successful projects are the ones that communicate with their broadcasters. We don't need to know every detail that's going on, but I do need to know the big stuff that's happening. So the more you keep those lines of communication open, the better off you'll be.
So don't ghost the broadcaster.
It's a terrible idea to ghost your broadcaster. Please don't do it. All right. And my last point, and I hope one that you guys all take into consideration, is development is a process and a negotiation. I know it can be a bit intimidating to sometimes work with a broadcaster. Understand that at any given time, I could have 15 to 20 projects on my plate. Likewise, so do the creative executives. So we're juggling just like everyone else. So if something's important to you at a development stage that you think we're not giving enough consideration to, tell us. At CBC, at least, we will always hear you out, but understand that we do have to work within certain parameters as well. My philosophy always is, if we can make it work, we will. And our ultimate goal at the end of the day is to make sure our development projects are successful should they be greenlit for production. So I ask producers to sort of just kind of give us as much information as possible to really help us do that. And that's it from me. I guess we have time for questions.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Niki, for demystifying the very scary business side of things. I had one question from me. Do we ever get to meet you in person, or are you just an email name or a voice on the phone?
Yeah, totally open to meeting in person. If you're ever at the building at Front Street in Toronto, come by. Obviously, post-pandemic, I'm working at home right now, as is everyone else. But if things return back to normal, definitely give me a shout.
Just for those watching, on your Eventbrite, there was an email where you can send your questions. So we'll be taking a few more questions until the bottom of the hour. For new creator producers, is there anything that we need to have in place before a development deal can be negotiated?
Yeah, I would say the big thing is to make sure you're incorporated. It's definitely an important consideration. That's for your benefit as much as it is for mine. So you're protected, especially if you're paying for third parties, and making sure your chain of title documentation is in order. We want you to have the rights before you come to us, and we want to make sure that you're able to do like the terms of production should you guys be greenlit.
Right. And if we are not like strong negotiators, or it scares us, should we be hiring a lawyer if that's not our wheelhouse?
You know, it is a complicated world sometimes, and I do understand that. So my short answer is you don't always need a lawyer. I'm happy to walk through some of the terms and agreements. Having said that, at the end of the day, I represent the broadcaster, and I want to make sure that you guys are also feeling comfortable with the terms that you're getting into. So if you're in doubt of sort of the terms of your agreement, like what the terms mean, your obligations, your rights, the last thing I want is for any creator to feel taken advantage of by their broadcaster, in which case get a lawyer if that's the case. All I ask, my only ask will ever be is get a Canadian entertainment lawyer if you're going to hire somebody. The ones from the US they're great lawyers, don't get me wrong, but sometimes they don't always understand the Canadian landscape. So a Canadian entertainment lawyer they know what they're getting into. They know what the broadcasters need. They know sort of that landscape. So you'll be better off for it. I did a deal, I remember, with an LA lawyer maybe a few years ago, and I'm pretty sure that development deal, like the legal bill was higher than what that development deal was for. Like I wasn't paying for it. CBC wasn't paying for it. It's the producers paying for that. It's fine if that's who you want as your representation, but just keep that in mind that cost will be incurred by you.
That's a good point. What about, do you have any idea of how long the negotiation process takes before the money starts to flow in?
Yeah, so development agreements, in terms of when we can actually negotiate a development agreement, they vary. So some development agreements take like a day to negotiate. They're very straightforward. There's nothing too complicated about it. Sometimes they take months, depending on sort of the complexity involved, the amount of parties that we need to pay. Again, once we get a deal done, it probably takes about 15 to 21 days to pay on that. But the big part is actually negotiating the deal at that point.
Okay. You had mentioned earlier that it's like a 12-month option deal with the broadcaster. So after that 12 months is up, is there any chance that it could be extended, or that a new deal would be negotiated?
Yeah, so we try to extend before our options up. That's the idea, but we could kind of put an additional phase past that point too. Again, our big preference is to do it within that time period. But as long as it's an active development with us, we are happy to sort of extend things as they need to be.
Okay, and then once either the term ends or you pass on it, can a producer go and pitch it to another broadcaster right away?
Yeah, that's sort of the deal. We do sort of have that credit and repayment obligation in there. So that would be the big thing, is to make sure that you're adhering to that term.
Right. There's a question about writers. If the project is not, if the writer is not part of the WGC yet, will part of the development deal cover the fee to join the guild?
I haven't seen that before, any fees to join the guild on agreement. I think it's part of the fringes. I might be wrong on that. I'm not sure exactly. I do see fringes in there, but I think it's an individual thing. So I'm not sure if I'm answering that question correctly, but I haven't seen that in particularly outlined in an agreement.
Okay. And I think, just as an aside, being a guild member, I think the rates are pretty low to join. So do you know, this, you might not, roughly how many projects or percentage of projects go into development?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it depends on sort of the creative area and the year that things happen to be pitched. So it's never like, if I give you a number, it's never going to be right. Like I could tell you something now and it will change later. But yeah, I think it depends on sort of the creative area, what's sort of needed. So in some years, I've seen like docs, a lot of it goes into production, but in other years, like that doesn't happen. So it really just depends on like what we require, what our development slates look like. If we need more stuff goes into production. If we need less stuff goes into production. It's just as simple as that.
Okay, great. There is a question that I think I'm going to skip. I'm just going to say it though and explain why. Someone is asking about like proof of concept or sizzle video before development. And I think it's just to clarify that Niki deals with things once they actually go into development. All of that would be before, like at your actual pitching stage, which is when you're talking to production execs. So there's a question about if you could talk about what repayment looks like.
Repayment? So should you be greenlit? Is that like, yeah. So should you be greenlit? So it depends on the amount of money that we put up into development. It would be all the funds that we had sort of paid. So if you're greenlit somewhere else, contact us and then we can sort of arrange on how to do that. So if you were given like $20,000 in development, we would expect that money repaid. If you're giving $5 in development, again, we would expect that money repaid. Doesn't matter on the amount, it's just sort of that obligation and of course the credit as well.
So someone is asking what a license fee is?
Oh, yeah, it's a very good question. So when we greenlight projects, that is not always 100% paid for by CBC. So it's not like we say, hey, you're greenlit, here's 100% of your costs of production. And that amount that we would be putting forward is what we refer to as a license fee. So those are negotiated at CBC and any broadcaster. Other things that would also finance production is considered tax credits and Canada Media Fund. There are sessions later on that will address some of that stuff a little bit more. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but license fee, your development amount is considered in advance on whatever license fee CBC is paying for. So that's where license fees kind of come into play in development.
Great. There's a question about LOI from CBC. I don't know what LOI is. Maybe you
Letter
can
of interest. Yeah.
the question.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah. So letter of interest. So what was the question? Sorry.
So someone has an LOI for a half-hour comedy, and with a little bit of CMF money that they've now written a pilot and a Bible. So what will be the next step to help fulfill a development phase?
Yeah, so I would say the first thing is contact your creative executive first, and then we can kind of go from there. So I'm not sure if what this one particular says, but that would be the first step is contact your creative exec, and we can navigate from there.
Great. And with the deliverables, who owns that material? Is it the producer? Is it the broadcaster?
Yeah, that's a very great question. So 99% of the time, it's the producer who owns those materials. Where we might have exceptions is for formats. Sometimes we do things. So formats like what is it? Family Feud was obviously one of our bigger formats that we've done. Sometimes formats, they will have, like, for development, they require the formats to be owned by that format holder. It really does vary. So sometimes CBC has to hold the rights to that. It just depends on the agreement. So again, it's not always straightforward, but 99% of the time, it's in my best interest to have the producer have the rights to their development materials as well. So it's just sometimes there's a bit of exceptions for reasons that are outside of our control.
Right. And when CBC greenlights a project, are they covered under CBC's insurance?
No, you would have to maintain your own insurance.
Okay. I'm wondering if you could talk about just a little bit more about the budget and top sheets. There was just a question about that. I know you referred to, like, going to the website. I guess especially for like a new creator producer, are there any like do's and don'ts or things to look out for?
Yeah, I think when you're creating your budgets, just making sure that what you actually need at that stage is important. And like I said, I sometimes get, especially from emerging creators, like very extensive, big budgets. They just want to do so much in development. But at the end of the day, they're only going to get a finite amount from us in terms of production. So never a good idea to sort of have to blow a lot of money in development. If you can sort of save, for lack of a better term, obviously it all has sort of purpose. But again, you just don't want to spend all your money in development. You want to spend a good chunk of that to be seen on screen as well.
Great. And working with a first-time writer, I guess this is from a producer. How would they work an option deal?
So if you're working with a first-time writer, I would say it's probably the same as you would with a more seasoned writer too. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all professionals here, and I think that's important, is that we're sort of all treated the same in that sense. But in terms of like what specifically you'd be looking at, I wouldn't be able to really speak to that. I will say as a general rule is we don't pay for concepts at CBC. So we sort of say it's a property with underlying value. So like a book, if you're adapting I've seen sometimes like adaptations of like YouTube series, as long as there's something that's sort of there that exists, we'll pay for those option fees. But as if it's just a concept or just an idea, we tend not to see. You still have to have sort of a deal in place to make sure you do have the rights to that. But it's usually a nominal amount, like $5, $3, something like that.
Okay, great. There's some questions about some numbers, if you don't mind getting into that in our last few minutes.
Yeah.
For consultants, is there a ballpark that people should allocate for consultants?
So it depends on what the consultant's doing. I've seen consultants to me is the most like vague area of budgets because it varies so much. So like my favorite consultant fee I ever got on a budget, it was a couple years ago. We had a show about robots, and I saw this line item in there, and I had no idea what this was. It was called a robot handler, and I was like, what's a robot handler? Like, so I had to call the producer and ask what a robot handler was. So it turns out like robots, kind of like animals, have like people who sort of help fix it and like kind of, it's a handler. Like, I don't really know how else to explain it, but that was like a mandatory cost that they had to pay in order to get access to these robots. So I will always ask questions on that. That was a consultant. Like, that was a consultant cost. So again, it varies depending on the project. I sometimes see story consultants as well. So let's say you're doing like a story on, like, I'm just trying to think, like mental health and addiction, and then you have like a counselor coming in, like that can be a story consultant too. So I would say it really, like, the consultant fees to me vary so much across the board, because it depends on how much they're actually bringing to the project, how much time you're spending with them, how much involvement they have in the materials and the scripts. So they do vary.
Okay. And
Yeah.
is that something that we would talk to you about and kind of figure out what seems reasonable depending on who they are? And
Exactly. Like sometimes I see like an honorarium, which is just sort of like a one-time fee. Sometimes I see day rates depending on how many days you're spending with them. It so varies on the project.
okay, great. And can you give us an idea of financial ranges for development funding, like if it's a pilot and season outline or a Bible?
Yeah, so I would say like the WGC is probably the best rate to kind of go to for script fees. So that would be your best first stop on that. And then we would talk about anything else that was sort of involved. So if Bibles, again, depends on who's sort of involved at that stage. And any story editing fees, like again, it's negotiable. So we just have to kind of see everything holistically and kind of work from there.
Is there like a minimum?
That's a good question, and the answer is no. I've done small deals, like very small deals, and I've done very big deals. So it doesn't. There's no, like, it just depends really what the creative is.
Right. Does it vary a lot between scripted and say doc series?
Yes, so definitely scripted series tend to be a little bit more, versus unscripted series. Just at least at the development stage, doesn't mean that's the case like throughout the entire production. But yeah, generally speaking, we do tend to see more development costs done at a scripted project than we do an unscripted one.
And what happens to a project if it doesn't go into production and it's never produced? Does the funding still need to be repaid?
If it's never done, no. So if it's just sort of, it's dead, it's dead. So we get that. That's a cost of our doing business too.
Right, right. Okay, great. Um, I think we're almost done,
Okay.
but one question that I know comes up for a lot of new creators is how can they stay involved with the project once the development deal is signed and kind of protect ourselves so that we don't get cut out of the process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not really sure if I can answer that necessarily. It sort of is, it's one of those negotiations where I can tell you for a fact, at least at CBC, we pick our teams very carefully and have that consideration. So if it like you had an idea and it's your story and then you were the one who was telling it, I think it would be very important for us to have you continually involved. That's not always the case for every project though. So I don't want to say like, yes, it's always important to have original creators. Creators sometimes leave projects. Sometimes they say, you know what, this isn't my thing anymore. And that's okay. Like, no one can force you to kind of stay on a deal if you don't want to be involved. But that's sort of what's there. So it's just, I think it's important that we kind of talk about it at that stage. But again, I can tell you for a fact, if there's a particular voice that was sort of needed at a stage of development, we would want that throughout the entire stage.
That's very reassuring.
Yeah.
um, and what about like if it's a newer producer, would you still kind of work with them or would you want them to team up with a more senior producer?
I like working with emerging creators personally. I think it's super important. I would say sometimes it's in the producer's best interest to kind of pair up with a more seasoned creator, but I always joke I get better budgets from emerging creators because they spend more time on them. So it's just, it really does vary. But I do like working with emerging creators. Yes, there's sometimes a bit of hand holding like anything if as soon as you're new at something, but I can tell you for a fact, we're definitely okay with that. I work with emerging creators all the time. They're usually my most favorite like producers or creatives to work with.
Amazing. Thank
Yeah.
you. I think we can sneak in one last question, maybe?
Can we?
No.
Yeah.
Can you build in life rights for docuseries into your budget?
It's a very good question. I think it depends on the project. I don't want to like put a blanket like yes or no. It really depends on the project. We have journalistic standards and practices that are available online. So sometimes we may not want you to pay for life rights on a documentary. It sort of depends. So I highly encourage you to look at those resources because I will ask you to adhere to that if you're doing a documentary with CBC.
Thank you.
Mhm.
We've run out of time, so I'd like to direct people to the Business and Rights CBC website, where we'll be posting any further answers or resources. And thank you so much, Niki, for this amazing talk. It totally demystified development deals with CBC for me and hopefully for others. And just a reminder that tomorrow's session is at 2 p.m. EST, but building a production budget. So hope to see you there. Thank you.